right. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome in. Glad that you were able to make it. I know that FabCon happened, a couple of weeks ago, and some of you may or may not have been there. If you were, you probably heard a lot of these announcements, but if you weren't there, that's better because it'll kind of be a little bit new to you. So what I tried to do was pull the signal out of the noise because there's a lot of things that they were talking about. And I'm going to try to lay this out as a straight shooter, this is how it is. And also talk about not just what was the new announcements, like the stuff that was actually new, but like the stuff they were really pushing out there as well. So a little bit of housekeeping. We have Q&A turned on or the chat. Feel free to drop in a lot of questions. There's a lot that's going to be going on. And we'll pause a couple of times just to make sure that we can answer any of the questions. I've got Suneer with me today. So he's going to be jumping in with some technical depth and maybe a healthy dose of here's what this actually means for you. And so, Suneer, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Suneer, primarily focusing on data and AI, working as an architect here. So I'm really happy to be here. Fair warning, I'll be the one telling you which features are actually available in your tenant today versus which ones Microsoft announced on stage with stage recently, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah, and that's kind of what the value is that we're trying to do here today, too, is just to give you the lowdown of things that happened that you need to know about. And we're going to call out pretty actively what's real and what's not real. So there were a lot of announcements. And when you strip away all the stage effects and, the one-liners underneath it all, unify your data estate first and then let the agents help. That's like the one-liner, the big takeaway. So everything else that was announced in FabCon, when you talk about like database or FabricIQ or the new OneLake security features, all the agentic, dev tooling, that's all downstream of that kind of sequencing. If you can't unify your data, then your agent, it's really just going to be kind of flying blind out there. So what else were you hearing out there?
Yeah, like the buzzes in the halls was just, wow, AI, right? It was finally one place to see and govern all my databases. So that's like very, very encouraging. I'm looking forward to take a deep dive into a lot of these. Database Hub got more traction than anything else, even though it's early access. So that's what my take on that is.
Yeah, we're going to dive deep in there. But before we go feature by feature, we talked a little bit about this. I just want to be upfront because I want to make sure that we're building, we're not pretending that everything on stage is brand new invention. Some of what got announced at FabCon is actually new stuff. Database Hub, that didn't exist before this convention. FabricIQ kind of, but it was basically released, in conjunction with FabCon. The planning in the right back direction is new territory, but some of what got on the stage, what got the energy is important, but it's kind of like an incremental sort of thing. For those of you that are in the developer world, I see this pattern happen all the time. Microsoft Build gets all the cool announcements. This is the stuff that's coming out, but none of it, it's all in private preview at Build. But when you get to Ignite, that's when things are actually starting to be real. Some of that happened here, at FabCon, right? So there were some private preview things that got rolled out, some things that went from private to just regular preview, and some things that went to GA. So I just want to make sure that we're, as we go through this, we're going to be calling that out and helping you sort of figure that out. And we'll be explicit about that, what's in the tenant and what's not available in the tenant. So on our slides, we're going to have you'll see it. It'll be GA and not GA and preview and all that kind of stuff. So on the platform architecture, let's take a big picture, a slice across the top, what does the map look like? It's not just, this is taking all those lists of the announcements and packaging them up into little areas. Step one, unify your data. What I'm talking about here is getting your data into OneLake, or at a minimum, getting it connected to OneLake via some of the shortcuts or the mirroring that's out there. One copy, one access point, one place that you're going to go get the data. Step two, though, is all about governance. So centralizing your security, centralizing your access policy, making sure that it enforces consistently across all those different engines that are reading the data. Step three, we're adding meaning to this. And this is really important. I've got some things that are probably going to go off script here and talk a little bit about. But FabricIQ, this is ontology, this is planning, this is the graph of your data, the semantic vocabulary that makes the AI outputs what they are. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I want to compare and contrast some things with some of the other platforms that are out there because I'm hearing a lot of signals from my customers. But step 4, we want like the whole purpose at this point of technology is to enable agents. We now have MCP tooling, we've got skills, we have jump starts, the real agentic developer experience that let you build fast agents. Now, once we have these step 1, 2, and 3 and have the foundation in place, you'll be able to do some of those things. Suneer, any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to call out that the database hub that we discussed in the last slide, it's not necessarily a fifth step, right? It's a management overlay that spans all those 4 blocks, right? Think of it as control plane views that gives you access to your entire estate, right? Regardless of where those databases live in the sequence, if that makes sense. Pretty much like OneLake spans across all your databases, Database Hub also gives you access to all of what you host in Fabric.
So as we're like kind of going through stuff today, think of this as like everything's going to fall into one of these 4 categories. So this is kind of like a reference map. So 5 announcements. These are the ones that have actual teeth, right? So they're either available today or they are going to force some architectural decisions that you have. So as I kind of walk through these, I want to set up a distinction that'll make the rest of the session a little bit more useful for you. 2 of these are genuinely new architectural bets, things that didn't exist before FabCon, and 3 are important, like general availability graduations of capabilities that have been building for months. So we're flagging a little bit of like which is which, and both of these matter because you have to incorporate these features of these things that we're going to be talking about into your roadmap and into some of the architectural decisions that you're going to make. Suneer's already talked a little bit about the database hub. That is your single pane of glass across your entire database estate. This is genuinely new now. Like this is something we've got a screenshot a little bit later, but it's genuinely new and it is early access at this point. So you're not going to see a lot of it right out of the gate, but we're going to start to see that incrementally over time. Direct Lake on OneLake, the Power BI performance story Microsoft called out, it's going GA at this point. Important graduation, but not necessarily a brand new idea. The OneLake security model, this is centralized policy. It's enforced at the query time. Multi-quarter effort that's kind of coming to a close and it's still rolling, but I think you're going to need to like verify some of the features and feature parity inside of your tenant as this stuff is kind of rolling out. The FabricIQ components, this is pretty new workload. I mean, I think like it was officially announced a couple of weeks before FabCon, but that was, basically when it was rolled out. This is huge. I can't talk enough about this. We did a webinar about it, I think a couple of weeks ago, or at least we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. And this is a genuinely big bet. I actually think this is a differentiator in how the different data platforms are going to look at agentifying or MCPing, their data. And Microsoft is not the only one doing this, but I think they're getting in early in the game. It's going to be a differentiator. And then lastly, like they are really elevating the agentic experience for developers, enabling MCP servers, allowing you to build skills. Some of the Jumpstart, stuff is new. Jumpstart stuff is coming out. MCP server, it's not new. Like the protocol's been around for a bit, but being able to flip that in Fabric is a new thing. Any other callouts that you have?
Yeah, I mean, the status badges, right, on these cards are doing real work. Some were introduced in the keynote with energy, but if you look at the Learn documents today, the preview is still stamped on more of them than the conference narrative suggested, right?
Always
and
does.
that's not unique to this conference. Like it's a pattern worth knowing about, so you can set expectations with your stakeholders before they set them for you.
Yeah, and really knowing that distinction, Suneer, right ahead of time is kind of what separates like a good roadmap from just like a compliance incident, right? Something like that.
Yep.
So, hey, I did say if there's any Q&A, let's pause, take a look. Anybody have any questions about what we talked about so far? Feel free to drop those into the chat or use the Q&A. I'll try to go back and forth. Suneer, call me out if I'm going too fast.
Nope.
So, all right, let's talk a little bit about the database. So genuinely new product surface. This is not a rebranding of anything that's been out there or already existed. And so it's a unified management surface inside of Fabric that spans things like your Azure SQL, Cosmos DB, Postgres, MySQL. All these things are kind of being in one single place. So one place to see the health of the ecosystem, performance recommendations, governance posture, and then also some of the cost, signals are there as well for the entire data estate. And so Microsoft is going to be layering some of these agent capabilities on top of this to help assist you in making some of the decisions that need to happen as well. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, technically this is a control plane abstraction, right? You're not rehosting your databases into Fabric. You're surfacing their management metadata into a single Fabric context, right? So the databases live where they live. What changes is your observability and governance surface. That's important to understand when you're sizing the adoption effort.
I want to be a little bit more specific. I said agent assisted, and it is in early access, but when we heard about this in the keynote, it seemed like the framing was a little bit ambitious. What's shipping today is really a little bit closer to Azure Advisor, but now we're going to bring that inside of Fabric. It is a unified view with AI recommendations, and it's going to allow you to act on those things. But think of it as more of an intelligent dashboard that aggregates signals, maybe suggests some new actions, but not like an autonomous agent that's managing your database estate. The roadmap here on agents, it's a pretty real roadmap of what they're doing. That there's no surprise if anybody that's following Microsoft on agents, but it's worth knowing that what we're talking about with this agent is, it's going to be rolling and kind of evolving over time. I think something that's interesting is the database savings plan. So Microsoft is claiming, we haven't seen this in real life yet, how this is going to translate, but bringing these workloads inside of Fabric, inside of the database hub, it could save up to 35% in the pay-as-you-go. That's coming straight off the marketing slicks, that they talked about. It's not, something that we've had a lot of experience saying this is what we're actually seeing. But they're starting to have a little bit more clarity on what that pricing and cost structure is going to look like inside of Fabric when you bring some of these operational data loads into it. When I was at Build last year and they started talking about SQL databases and other Cosmos databases coming into it, I even asked that question, what does this look like? How am I going to pay for this? What does this all inclusive in the Fabric capacity? And they really didn't have a good picture of that. That's starting to have a little bit more clarity now. So if we are going to get these 35% versus pay-go, I think that's great, but I still want to see how this is going to, what the cost structure is going to look like on some of this. So more to come on that. And, I wanted to reflect a little bit because we're a little late, meaning it's been a few weeks since FabCon. And let's just talk a little bit about what some of the community is actually hearing. And Suneer, at some point I'm going to ask you what you're hearing too. But one LinkedIn comment kind of captured the sentiment perfectly. So Power BI admins, now they're the database estate managers. What's going on here, right? And that's kind of the real question. Who owns this operational services? Is it going to be the DBAs now? Is it the platform teams? Are Fabric admins the one that are going to be owning these things? If you don't start to think about it and you define these things before you onboard some of these production, workloads, I think that there's going to be more of an accountability gap and not really a governance platform. So we got to really, start thinking about this. What are you hearing too? Is there similar sentiments, Suneer?
Yeah, several different organizations are structured different way with respect to who manages what, right? So from clients, mostly we have been seeing DevOps model recently. So I've seen data engineers owning the platform and then tweaking the knobs as needed.
Yeah,
I've seen dedicated IT professionals who are in charge of the administrative processes inside Fabric, and then the engineering team requesting them. So I've seen it both ways, right? So one thing that I'd like to add is this agent recommendation piece. It's interesting, right? Right now, think of it as your database estate plus an AI Copilot that flags things, right? It's not taking autonomous actions. But you'll want guardrails defined before it surfaces in front of stakeholders, right, who might act on those recommendations without validation. Because many a times there is a gap when you have a dedicated admin versus a data engineer who kind of have a little bit more of deep dive into what's going on and how this could be tweaked, right? So just calling that out.
That's a really good call out. So bottom line, this stuff's early access, which means it's a great time to start thinking about what the impacts of this is. And maybe one thing I can recommend is start thinking about and defining what your operating model is going to look like. Start coming up with RACI charts, delegation rules. What kind of agentic actions are you going to start to allow as this stuff? That's where this is going. But have those conversations early now before you have to like flip switches with the agents and turn some of these features on. Then you'll be ready to scale this out, and start bringing in more of these operational workloads into the system, into the ecosystem. So OneLake security, I think the vision here is pretty clear. And for me, it seems to be going in the right direction. You're going to define your access policies in one place. And that enforcement now is going to travel with the data across every engine that reads from OneLake. And this is important, right? So meaning that now that I have an ecosystem that I can have a set of policies, it can apply to all of those. Currently, with your analytics workload, you've got a disconnect between your policy management in Fabric and all these other operational workloads that are being built by your different platform teams, your different, software teams. So this is really going to help keep Power BI, SQL endpoints, all your notebooks, everything. All these things are going to be under that same governance roof. RBAC roles, are going to be encoded at the row level and column level constraints. All that stuff's going to be consistent across the top. Write the policy once and enforce it everywhere at every time. Like that's how this is supposed to work. I think it's a great move. What are your thoughts on this, Suneer?
Yeah, my thoughts on this is like the real picture can be slightly different than the vision, right? Although vision is in the right path, right? The cross workload enforcement is not fully consistent. There are documented gaps, particularly around the column level security in certain direct link scenarios and Spark access paths where enforcements behave differently than it does through the SQL world, right? Or SQL analytics endpoint rather. So the policy definition and central authoring story is still solid. The every engine behaves identically part is close, but it has seams. That means like before you architect your production security posture on the unified enforcement model, you need to test the specific engines your org has, and verify they behave the way you expect. Because I'll tell you, in a typical medallion architecture, some people prefer to have gold in a Delta Lake environment, which is pretty much a lake house, and that acts differently than a SQL analytics endpoint, which is Fabric data warehouse, right? And I've seen it both ways. There are reasons why one chooses one versus the other. So just leaving it that.
Yeah, and I would say like it's also this rolling thing where different workloads are coming in at a different pace. So Azure SQL is not going to come in at the same pace as Cosmos, the same as pace as Postgres. So when you're looking through the Learn docs, I'm seeing things that are being labeled as preview still, where it kind of in the Fabric narrative, it was like listed as like GA. So keep track of this. You're going to see a lot of rolling announcements. Verify what's active, not just in the Learn docs, but also like it might be kind of rolling in various tenants as well. So check on those things before you like commit to leadership that, hey, we're going to turn this feature on because I read about it or I saw this like blog post and Brian and Suneer were talking about it. It was really cool. Run, at least one design workshop, test it across different workloads, different deployments, and make sure that it's working end to end before you commit to it would be kind of my thought. So then we've got this like new concept, Direct Lake on OneLake, which right now Microsoft is calling generally available. And this has been around for a little bit, and it's it's kind of one of those things where it's graduating now, right? And so it's a little bit of new feature development, but really just kind of like graduating into like a general availability. It's been building to this point, for about a year. Here's why it matters. Right now, your Power BI semantic models read directly from OneLake Delta tables and have like import class performance problems, right? No schedule refresh windows, no data duplication into the semantic models and in-memory cache and all that kind of stuff. The data lives once in OneLake and the engine now reads it there. So for the right workloads, this is going to really change the game. And I know that you've been dealing with this a lot, Suneer, in some of the projects that we've been working on. How do you think this is going to change, the game? And are there any limitations that you want to kind of call out with what's being released at this point?
Yeah, the limitations that I would call out is Direct Lake is not feature parity with import mode, and teams get surprised mid-migration when they find these edges, right? Composite model support is constrained. You cannot freely mix direct lake tables with import tables in all configurations. XMLA endpoint behavior changes in ways that affect some external tools and custom deployments, I have to be honest. User-defined aggregations work differently than they do in import mode. So that's another difference. And row-level security has nuances in direct lake that can catch some teams off guard. If their RLS patterns were built in with the import mode assumptions, let's say. But none of these are blockers for most of the workloads. Let me clarify that as well. But my recommendation is to build your migration rubric against these specific constraints before you commit scope, because definitely there is advantages in going a direct lake pattern for your semantic models.
Again, I would say with a lot of this stuff that's coming out of FabCon, that's going to be a generally good advice, right? Two things that change kind of technically at scale that I think are worth calling out. So first, the OneLake layout, how your Delta tables are partitioned with viewer sort directly impacts your query performance. So now that's a Power BI performance concern and not just a data engineering concern. Second, your security model for OneLake is your security model for Power BI. And your semantic model is no longer going to just be like BI plumbing anymore. It's the contract that's going to exist for most of these AI-assisted analytics. I would also say if your model naming and measure definitions are sloppy, your AI outputs, they're going to be, let's say, confidently wrong, right? And I think that's where a lot of organizations are getting kind of burned right now, is by having some of these sloppy definitions and not really paying attention to it and thinking that they're just going to be able to flip these switches on and everything's going to be fine. Some SQLCon highlights. I know FabCon, and SQLCon was kind of combined. So for the SQL practitioners, that are sitting here, I'd say three things. Discan, vector indexing. Microsoft shipped some meaningful preview upgrades. Specifically, they removed some of the read-only table restrictions that were blocking many of the teams from actually using it in practice. If you tried it early and you kind of hit that wall, maybe, I would say go back and give it another shot. It's worth retesting. You might find some improvements. This is available in both Azure SQL Database and SQL databases in Fabric as well. So still preview, so I wouldn't bet like the SLA farm on it. But if you need better vector search, over structured enterprise data, the SQL ecosystem is going to start supporting you a little bit better. Your perspective on that?
Yeah,
what patterns are working?
Yeah, the patterns is worth understanding here, right? So Discan is approximate nearest neighbor vector index for high dimensional similarity search, right? So the use case is retrieval augmented generation, right? So to make your, large language models say the facts, right? So instead of sending an agent to a vector database that lives outside your SQL environment, you keep the semantic search co-located with your transactional data. So that reduces the data movement and latency for certain workloads. It's still in preview. So the prototype, I would say prototype in non-prod environments and measure the index maintenance overhead, before you scale it. Because the moment, you have to maintain these indexes on your transactional data, you also need to actually balance it with your rest of your transactional systems performance. For example, writes, right? So it's in one way, it's good that you're not duplicating. You do not have to duplicate your data and make the data move from one place, but have a little bit of measurement on how much of indexes needs to be maintained. So that's what my take on that would be.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the change event streaming. SQL Server's play right now for event-driven architecture is this change data without building custom CDC pipelines. So this is still a preview feature, so let's call that out really quick. But I think the instinct is, kind of strong in the community, and, guys like Chris Wagner and Mike Carlo, some of the guys that I, follow quite regularly, they're echoing some of this and saying that use event streaming where it actually changes your outcomes, not just because streaming sounds like more modern than batch. So be intentional about it. And if your consumer can tolerate maybe a 5-minute latency, you don't need streaming pipelines. So avoid some of that operational complexity that's going to come with this. And then moving on, I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time here. We got quite a lot of slides left yet.
We're good. with respect to, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, all right. So GitHub Copilot now generally available with SQL Management Studio. AI assisted SQL authoring is essentially what you're getting out of this, and it's going to exist within your tool chain now without a lot of context switching. So that's kind of a cool, meaningful productivity shift. I don't think this should surprise anybody. This is, where everything's kind of going, is having these coding tools available to you. But one thing I want to be like kind of transparent about is that this is primarily an Azure SQL and SQL tooling kind of announcement. It showed up in the narrative probably because SQL database and Fabric benefits from this as well. But it's not like a Fabric only story. Your DBAs are going to get this regardless whether you're using Fabric or not, SSMS integration. But that makes it kind of a cool thing too, right? So definitely a good announcement on that one. Quick visual reference. So these are some of the actual UIs that they're talking about. On the left side here is kind of showing the SSMS Copilot panel. That's what it kind of looks like today. I'll let you kind of go through this when you walk through each of these screenshots.
Yeah, what I love about this is when you actually do a select star, it's technically correct, right? However, you can see that Copilot is giving advice here like a senior engineer would give to a mid-level or a junior engineer, right? Or an architect would give to the engineering team. It's saying okay, are you sure you want to actually do a select star? Because it actually does retrieve all the columns from your customer table in this example, right? What if your customer's table is super wide and you do not need everything? Do you want to really pull all of that in your columnar databases, right? Instead, it is suggesting a change. Why don't you just go with customer ID, first name, last name, right? There is no syntactical errors in what is being pulled. It is still suggesting a performance improvement. So that's really inspiring to see.
Well, yeah, and it's doing that based off of context too. It's not just
Exactly.
Saying, right, it's looking at the entire holistic procedure that you're working on and saying, hey, you're really only using this stuff.
Exactly.
Select star is going to be really not going to perform as well. What about the other two?
So yeah, Discan for Azure Postgres, flexible server. So there is vector compression and quantization that would happen, on your top of your vectors. And this time we are saying you do not have to move the data. You can literally place it on top of your transaction layer, and with indexes, it will be able to actually send your LLM queries that is converted into vectors back into your transaction systems, which is indexed. So that's inspiring to see. So the other one is primarily your SQL tooling management, as it was kind of similar to what we were talking about, the database hub, right? You can actually have all of your SQL databases managed in one layer. So in a way, I agree with the fact that Microsoft is betting on that'll help you reduce 35% of the cost. I think they are indexing on the fact that you have a holistic view of everything under one page, and then it helps. More often than not, it helps that rather than having to go to different, cost monitors and different services to tweak the knobs, right? So sometimes
it's a different team that's looking at that stuff, right? So this gives you the visibility right inside of the Fabric ecosystem. So
this is genuinely useful to track. When I'll add a couple more things. Several of the features that were in preview at FabCon have been moving to GA on a rolling basis. That page will tell you exactly what changed and when. So I would recommend keeping a tab of it. So.
Oh yeah, that's a good call out too.
Yeah.
That's a good place to look instead of relying on Learn Docs that you look at every 6 months, right?
Yep.
Fantastic. So, all right. So here's a slide that I think some of us should start paying attention to, because FabricIQ, it's not just a feature announcement. I think it's a platform bet. I said I have a lot of opinions about this, and I think we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about it. So it's a genuinely new workload, genuinely new direction. And it's the one that I think is going to have the longest range impact, especially of the announcements this year, on how you build, architect, think about AI solutions inside of the Microsoft ecosystems. So here's the problem this is the problem that we're trying to solve. Most AI deployments on enterprise data fail, not because you're using the wrong model or the model is stupid. It's failing mostly because the data that you're feeding it is ambiguous. A good example of that might be revenue. When you talk about revenue, that's going to mean different things to finance, who cares about actual revenue, right? But sales has a different definition where they look at revenue as maybe like closed, deals. This is the revenue that I promised to the business. And, that all lives in the side of the data warehouse, but it's not easy for it to interpret what that means. So an AI agent that says like, hey, I got to go figure out revenue doesn't really, it's querying your tables and not knowing what tables it's supposed to be querying. And it doesn't really know what those tables mean. So it's going to give you a confident answer, but depending on who's asking the question, it may be the right answer, it might be the wrong answer. So FabricIQ's answer to that is, it's still in preview, but it's a workload that groups 4 different capabilities. So ontology, what is the shared business vocabulary, your entities and like relationships? It's a plan, so the budgets and forecasting layer. It has graph, which is your relationship-based, queries across different entities and understanding of that. And then agents that operate within all of that semantic context to sort of manage that information as well. A good example of that would be like, I've got this massive, 1,000 table schema. I can't go in and like define every column and everything. So I have agents that can operate on that semantic context and start to understand based not on just some metadata that defines that column or that field or whatever, but also on the data itself. I know you've been working a little bit with this, Suneer. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, from an architectural standpoint, the significant thing is the integration point, right? When a framework agent calls into Fabric with FabricIQ in place, it's not just querying a table, it's querying with awareness of your business context, your entity definitions, your security policies, like that, right? So you go from like a statistically plausible to semantically grounded, information. That's a real and a meaningful difference, in my opinion. So.
That is definitely a big difference. All of this is really going to hold if your semantic model is well built, right? Yep. If your org, has a semantic model that's like messy and it's got poorly named measures, maybe a bunch of different duplicated tables with different information in it, no real governance principles or discipline, some of the names of people that are here, you know who you are. The agents, they're going to reflect that mess in the same confidence as they would in like a real clear world. And we see this with hallucinations all the time. So FabricIQ isn't going to fix your semantic model, but it's actually going to amplify your semantic model. And whatever quality is there, whether it's good or bad, is going to be amplified. Just think about that a little bit, as you start to build these things. You're going to have to pay attention to your, to what your data is telling an AI model and telling the semantic model, which is probably, I would just say, like a little foreshadow here, another reason why the governance baselines that are being here, put in place. And, we're going to talk about a little 90-day plan. These aren't optional things if you want to start using some of these tools. So, here's how the layers actually connect. So we've got trusted data on the left, got everything that's grounded in OneLake. It's governed by the security model that we talked about a little bit earlier. And that's going to flow into FabricIQ in the middle here. The ontology is going to define that business vocabulary. The plan layer is going to handle budgets and forecasts. You've got the graph, which is going to enable all those different like relationship queries. And then, finally, the agents that are going to operate with all that context. And then on the right side is where you get the business outcomes, the governed Q&A, the planned, workflows, and the audit-ready, agent actions. This is a lot to digest, Suneer. What's your take?
Yeah, the critical shift is like an agent on the right side of the diagram is not asking what values are in this table, right? It's asking what is the approved revenue number for example, Q2 as defined by my finance ontology for the Eastern region for users with my access level, for example, right? That's a fundamentally more trustworthy answer. And it's worth knowing that Databricks is pursuing a similar vision with Genie and Unity Catalog. They have had production deployments of the semantic layer plus agents patterns running longer than FabricIQ has been in preview. So I mentioned that not to undermine the direction. The direction is right. But because if your customers are asking why not Databricks, that's a fair question. The answer is not Fabric is better. The answer is like if you are already Microsoft Stack native, the integration story across Teams, Office, Power Platform, and Azure is an operational advantage Databricks generally cannot match at all. So on pure AI over data maturity right now, it's closer than the keynote implied. So
yeah, I think that's a really good call out. So I have customers, Concurrency has customers that are Snowflake, Databricks, et cetera. And one of the things that like really jumped out at me was one of my customers, a Snowflake customer, turned on MCPs and started like using it over a couple of different data domains that they use on a regular basis, right? And they were super underwhelmed by it. And I started thinking about like, how does that position Microsoft and with FabricIQ? The reason why Snowflake is failing at this, or not failing, but underwhelming people, is because they don't have FabricIQ. They don't have a semantic understanding. It's just their version of it is just translating SQL queries, your natural language into SQL queries, which is valuable, but you're going to get a lot of garbage back from it. I think Databricks has been doing this longer, though, and candidly speaking, they're probably a little bit ahead, from where Microsoft is in terms of the semantic modeling. But, to your point, and I think you called it out really well, if you're already natively inside of this Microsoft ecosystem, that's where the value proposition is. You get kind of the best of both worlds. I don't know. Don't try to build like a universal ontology to solve this problem. I think if I was going to give anybody some advice, I'd say start with one domain and build a small ontology that's tied to like some of the specific decisions that you want to make. Thinking back to that customer of mine in Snowflake, if they would have like taken the time to look at that data domain and what they're really trying to expose to it and build ontology across it, think of it in that kind of direction. And if you do that, I think you're going to find some quick wins. And I would say like the biggest differentiator isn't really the platform, it's the process and the scope of what your ambitions are that are gonna drive success in these kind of projects. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about some of the finances and the planning capabilities in Fabric. And this is getting like a disproportionate community attention, and I think deservedly so. These types of questions around, planning the finance gap have been coming up ever since Fabric was released and talked about. And the finance teams, they've been kind of like just living with problems for decades. Budgets in Excel, actuals, data warehouse, forecasting as a separate tool, reconciling them. We have a bunch of like full-time jobs just taking data from one system to the other. And I think some of the like FabricIQ planning is going to like help with some of that, giving governed context, not with just like recognizing differences or doing some of that analytic workload, but actually having some write back capabilities, right? So there is a little bit of a scope boundary that I want to like maybe put down, on the table before anybody like puts it in the chat, or, more importantly, even goes back and like pitches any of this as like a EPM replacement. If your organization's running things like, OneStream, Adaptive Insights, or have any kind of other mature planning tool, FabricIQ planning is like in its current preview form is not like a rip and replace kind of thing. Those platforms have years, of workflow maturity, approval chains, version controls, sandbox environments, GL integrations, all that stuff that auditors like, want and actually trust. FabricIQ planning is compelling. It's cool that they're going to be doing it. But if you have a dedicated EPM tool, I would stick with that for now and just keep an eye on where this is going. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, preview, treat it as a control pilot, right? Auditability and stewardship are non-negotiable for finance workflows. Before you roll this out into your financial planning and analytics, you need clear answers on who can write back what approval chain what does your approval chain look like,
Yeah.
And how changes are logged, right? And align your FabricIQ semantic definitions with your existing BI semantic model. So you're not creating a new which number is right problem, right? Because that's what we are trying to solve here, right? Yeah, that's what my take on that is.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple of customers that we should be talking to about some of this right now as I'm just sort of like thinking this through without the webinar going, through my head fast. All right, here's the thing. Pick one pilot. Focus on like one simple workflow, right? Forecast maybe versus actual. That's kind of like what I was thinking here. Where I'm thinking, Suneer.
Yeah.
But, pick something clean, right? Pick something that you already understand pretty well. And, if it does work, then, this is going to be a story that's worth telling. And if it doesn't work yet, well, you've scoped out something that you failed fast enough to be able to scope it out of the picture. All right, we got about 14 minutes left. So for the engineers or the real nerds, on the call, I want to give you maybe a little bit of the honest competitive picture that I think it's going to be a little bit more useful than maybe just a Microsoft only narrative. So 3 different announcements: Fabric MCP, skills for Fabric, and Jumpstart. I want to start with MCP because there's a comparison that's kind of worth making right now. So Model Context Protocol, this has been around for a bit, and it's a standard interface that lets AI agents interact with tools. And data can be one of those tools essentially, but it's to interact with tools. So Microsoft published MCP server documentation and tooling for Fabric, which basically means that you can build agents that directly call Fabric operations. You can run a pipeline, you could query a semantic model, or maybe create like some sort of workspace artifact. And you can do that through a standardized agent to Fabric protocol. So that's pretty cool. Snowflake has MCP, and so does Databricks. They have different versions of them doing different things. So the question I think that's kind of worth asking right now is like, what actually makes Fabrics different? What are your thoughts on what makes it different, Suneer?
Yeah, my honest answer on that is like Snowflake's MCP, as people who have tested it are discovering, exposes raw schema context to the model, like table names, column names, data types, whatever descriptions you've added to your catalog. So when an agent calls in, it's working with schema, not business meaning. So the result is syntactically valid SQL. That could be semantically wrong, right? And the model is confident about it. So we have seen hallucinations and stuff, right? So customers who have tried it on anything more complex than a single table can hit a wall fast. So Fabric MCP's real differentiator is the semantic model layer. 20 plus years of analysis services heritage, carrying business definitions, hierarchies, measures with proper DAX logic, right? RLS, and explicit entity relationships. So when an agent queries through a well-built semantic model, it's getting a curated business view, not a raw schema dump, which is technically right, but not semantically right, if that makes sense. That's, a substantive difference, in fact. So.
Yeah, and the conditional I think I want to be a little bit more, be honest about is that this differentiation only really holds if your semantic model is well built. We talked about that already. If you got a messy model, it's not going to help. It's going to be just as bad as Snowflake, right? Just with a little bit more infrastructure that's kind of governing around it. In its current form, without FabricIQ ontology in place, Fabric MCP is closer to the Snowflake experience than it is to what the keynote probably implied. So you're going to have to pay a little bit of attention to that. So skills for Fabric is open source on GitHub, and we're talking about standardized, governance-aware skill templates for AI coding agents to author and operate Fabric workloads. The value, I think, is really in the defaults, security and governance patterns that are already baked into the into these skills. You can fork these out, fork them in Git and build internal golden prompts on top of them. And then Jumpstart, the reference implementations and accelerators that install directly into your workspace. They're fast. You're going to get time to value and be able to kick out some demos pretty quick. And same thing here. You can fork, harden, and bake your own, into your policies as well. So those are a couple things that, we'll probably see a lot of momentum over the second half of this year as people start to experiment with them. And love the fact that, we've got, open source opportunities to contribute as a community as well. I know what Suneer is going to be doing is going to be submitting some pull requests. So, all right, where to go next? What do you think?
Yeah, resource call out here, right? These are the actual repos, github.com, Fabric skills for skills, the Fabric Jumpstart for Fabric, for jumpstarting, obviously. MCP server documentation is on Microsoft Learn under the Fabric Get Started section. Pull them up, fork them, start there rather than a blank page. The defaults are better than most teams write themselves on day one, right? So I would highly recommend that. So I'll be real with you. The auth setup for MCP is where the time goes, right? Service principals, OneLake API permissions, workspace access. Budget 2 days for that before your first real demo instead of 2 hours. So that'll be my
take. Not 2 hours, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on real quick. I know we're butting up on time here. What are people actually saying? So I think it's important to kind of have context around what the actual conversations are happening, not just in this conference, but like reading the blogs, what are the people talking about afterwards? Here's just 4 quotes that I came across that I thought I would kind of capture, and share with you, because it's more practitioner reality and not something that's coming out of like official recap. So on the top left, the database hub RACI question, people are asking this publicly on LinkedIn, and it started within hours. This came right. It was like probably the first thing that I saw, and it's a legitimate operational question. The product team really doesn't have an answer for this yet, and hopefully they're going to have one, pretty quick, because people are clamoring about it. Verify your tenant first. Caution, with like a lot of people that are trying to play with this. And, as I've said, I've been through this keynote, GA, reality kind of cycle before. It looks good up on the screen. But then when you go to click the buttons, it's not there. And even when you look at the Learn docs and the tech docs, the button says it, you can even see the picture of the button, but it's not there. The 403 errors. There's definite reality here that there's errors happening in these APIs, in the agentic tooling threads. Not a reason to stay away from it, but it's a reason, I think, like you said it, right? Budget a couple hours or a couple of days, not a couple of hours. Mm-hmm. So just have kind of the right frame of mind when you go into this. And then the ontology, it is exciting. I would absolutely say that it is exciting, but don't try to model everything at one time. Try to learn some of the muscle memory that's going to go into it. The people that were at FabricCon, they're going to have this natural inclination to just want to jump back in and get everything, in FabricIQ, and you're going to burn out real quick. What are your thoughts?
Yeah,
anything else you'd call out?
Yeah, my pattern, my thoughts on, all these quotes are the same, right? It's all of the same pattern, I would say. The direction is right. The vision is coherent. The platform is moving fast. But the gap between keynote confidence and the production reality is real and consistent. So treating that gap as expected rather than surprising is what separates the teams that succeed, rather than, coming after 6 months and saying, it didn't work. So.
All right, I'm going to fly through. We got just a couple minutes. Just backseat, operational reality. I'd say 3 things that I'm going to call out really quick. First off, there's a lot of preview sprawl, right? Things that are saying GA doesn't mean it's going to be available necessarily in your tenant. So just make sure you check on that. Operating model, this is going to change how you think about governance and ownership and stewardship. People that have been investing in data domains and data owners are probably going to find themselves ahead of the game a little bit. And then also, there's going to be some learning curves here with new authorization patterns, new CI/CD patterns, and that's probably going to cause some friction, with you as you start to adopt this. So what does that mean, kind of moving forward? Verify here before you build stuff. If you're still on the call, thank you for sticking around. Take a quick screenshot of this, or better yet, reach out to us and, we can walk you through some of this. But verify, the maturity, not just the decision, is it available, but the maturity of it. Do I want to start building on this product, or do I want to wait until this gets into a GA, or even wait for a little bit longer? And then I've got a couple of slides here that I'm not going to be able to get through here and, spend any kind of time, but I put together a quick little 90-day action plan, and I'll just quickly talk about each one of those. The first one is, probably the first, week or two, establish some sort of truth and governance baseline for the organization. Inventory things like the domains and the top semantic models that your organization wants to use. Find out where the pain is the worst, right? And that's where your focus is, focus should be. Then in the first month, start looking at DirectLake and OneLake and build out some sort of an optimization pilot. This probably means 1 or 2 semantic models that you can use, but the goal here is to really just validate the DirectLake feasibility. Check it out, make sure that's going to work for your case, test the governance behavior, across the end-to-end before you proceed. And then in month 2, start playing around with, some of the brittle options, mirroring and ETL, like, kind of workloads that can be simplified or enhanced. But this is going to cause like, some amount of change in, within the organization. So this would be kind of like your month 3, kind of activity. And then finally piloting a semantic grounding and then your agentic workflows. So you see how I kind of piece this all together, starting off, with some of the planning and then the governance. And now eventually we're going to start being able to play with these workloads, and agents. So try to follow these like, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 steps. And then I'll keep you on a good path within like a 90-day kind of like, framework. So if you want to reach out to us, I've got my LinkedIn here and Suneer's LinkedIn here too. I could have talked a little bit faster to get through this, I guess, but hopefully this gave you a pretty clear picture of what's changed. But more importantly, it's not just what's changed and what's changing, but what's actually ready and what you can do next. So we dropped a link in the chat here for you to reach out to us or give us some feedback. If you want us to reach out, just go ahead and fill out a little bit in the survey. Most importantly, I just want to say thanks for joining us today. I know your time's valuable and really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.